Hello and welcome. We are about to start the conference. Before we start, I just want to give some explanations on how to use the interpretation function. We are going to have speakers presenting both in English and in Japanese. And for those watching via Zoom, we offer simultaneous interpretation. If you are watching from a computer, please look for the interpretation icon in your Zoom toolbar. You might need to hover over the bottom of your screen to make it appear. So click interpretation and select the language you would like to hear from the list. If you would like to hear the interpreted language only without the original in the background, please select mute original language. If you don't need interpretation, please select off. If you are watching this from a phone, please tap on the three dots, and then tap language interpretation and choose your language. Click done. If you would like to hear the interpreted language only without the original in the back, please tap the toggle to mute original language. If you don't need interpretation, please select original audio. Now we're gonna do this explanation in Japanese, and then we're gonna be ready to set and start this conference. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Friends, thank you for joining our first online world conference, Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Resist and Reverse the Climate Crisis for Social and Economic Justice. We initially planned to hold this conference in New York City at Riverside Church. We had more than 1,500 people registered by early March. We had planned to have 30 speakers and at least 24 forums and workshops. It would have been wonderful if we could have all seen and taken energy from one another there. That said, even as most of us shelter in place and do all that we can to help those who are most vulnerable to COVID-19, for the last 6 weeks, our planning committee has been learning how to put on the conference, and we are in the early stages of planning additional sessions for the future. We have a remarkable array of speakers, scholars, and movement leaders today from across the world. I also want to celebrate that we are more than 1,000 people from India, Nepal, Japan, Korea, across Europe, Africa, Latin, and North America, with many more joining us via live stream. Welcome to you all. As we begin, some logistical announcements. I want to thank Mariana Fernandez of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, who is serving as our Zoom conferencing wizard. We are also very fortunate to have been in the prom of the Control Arms Foundation in India and Emily Rubino of Peace Action New York State as our moderators today. I also want to acknowledge the many people who have played less public roles in organizing today's conference. We'll be giving them something approximating the recognition they deserve on our website. As you will have seen in our agenda, our 2 hours are very tightly packed. Each panelist will speak for no more than 10 minutes. Their talks will be followed by Tanaka Terumi's report about the progress of the Hibakusha signature appeal, which has so far garnered more than 10 million petition signatures. High Representative Nakamitsu Izumi will then respond to Tanaka-san's report. Time permitting, after we do a very brief group photograph, we'll have a brief question and answer period. And we will share the URL where you can find our organizer's statement, which will also be sent to all conference participants. Let me now turn the screen over to Emily Rubino, who will launch us into this stage of our work for a nuclear weapons-free, peaceful, just, and environmentally stable world. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you, Joseph. Welcome, everyone. I am honored to introduce our first speaker, who is Wada Masako-san, who is an A-bomb survivor and Assistant Secretary General of the Nihon Hidankyo, Japan Confederation of A and H bomb sufferers organization in Japan. So thank you. Welcome, Wada-san.
Yes. On the 75th anniversary year of the atomic bombings, I feel very honored and grateful for this opportunity to speak before you in this first online world conference against A and H bombs. I am Wada Masako of Nihon Hidankyo. Nagasaki was devastated by the atomic bomb when I was 1 year and 10 months old, as I'm one of the youngest Hibakusha. On that day, I was at my house, located 2.9 kilometers away from the blast center. Thanks to the mountains surrounding the central part of Nagasaki City, which shielded my house from the direct impact of the bomb, I suffered no burns or injuries and have survived to this day. As I was only a baby then, I do not remember anything about that time myself. But as I grew up, my mother related the story of her experience over and over again. With the A-bomb explosion, window panes Clay walls and the sliding doors of our house were all blown to pieces by the blast. A pile of mud and dust over 30 centimeters. It was left on the floor. On the road along the mountain surface, which had turned brown, my mother saw a pile of people escaping from fires like ants moving down over the mountains toward our community. Numerous maggots as big as your thumb were swarming on the burns and wounds of the victims, who were laid all over the floor of a college auditorium. Dead bodies scattered in the streets were collected and thrown onto garbage carts. They are piled up like those with their arms and legs sticking out of the heaps. They were carried into the empty lot next to a house and incinerated and cremated day after day. My mother soon became numb, even to the stench from burning bodies, losing the scene of their humanity. What is human dignity? Humans are not created to be treated like this, incinerated like garbage. After the atomic bombing under the occupation of the United States, press reports about the atomic bombing were strictly suppressed. Hibakusha were not informed about the causes of their suffering, both physically and mentally, or their economic difficulties. They were left abandoned without any help, either from the Japanese or US governments for 10 years, and hid themselves from society in forced silence. Most victims who were unable to receive any relief measures were recorded simply as statistics. By the end of December 1945, about 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki had died as a result of the bombings. Most of them were civilians, including the elderly, women and children, and the number of deaths continued to increase in ensuing years. Now, those who have managed to survive have grown old. Our average age is 83 years old. The Hibakusha's deep suffering continued for a long period, even to this day. The loss of their loved ones, survivors' guilt, scenes, sounds, and smell of the day burnt into their memories. Diseases of unknown causes, economic difficulties, prejudice, and discrimination in society, and many buried dreams. Those who were under the mushroom cloud, irrespective of their race, nationality, age, or sex, were forced to die or to continue to live as Hibakusha. The A-bomb impact on people's physical and mental health is seen even among those who were in mother's uterus on those days, and also among the second generation of the Hibakusha. For the last 64 years, since the founding of Nihon Hidankyo in 1956 as the only national organization of the Hibakusha, we the Hibakusha have maintained our pledge to save humanity from its crisis through the lessons learned from our experiences, while at the same time saving ourselves, as stated in our founding declaration. With this commitment, we have preserved our work to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world by giving testimonies about our experiences across the world. Under no circumstances should these anti-human weapons ever be used again. This is the ardent and sincere desire of all the Hibakusha. There are those who have created the atomic bombs and those who used them. And there are also those who were pleased by their destructive power and consequences. These people are absolutely unpardonable. But we Hibakusha have never wished to take vengeance on them. We know that if a nuclear weapon is to be used for the third time, there would be no one who would survive and rejoice about its devastation. In an atomic desert where nothing is left, who can be proud of the might of national power, status, or prestige? Nuclear weapons, which continue to be created on the pretext of deterrence and not for actual use, are nothing but a negative human power dictated by a nuclear weapon, not justice. In April 2015, we started the International Hibakusha Appeal signature campaign using the elimination of nuclear weapons. So far, we have submitted more than 1 million signatures on this petition to the United Nations, which generated big momentum for achieving the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. When the treaty was adopted in the UN negotiation conference in July 2017, Hibakusha were overwhelmed with joy, thinking that our survival had been rewarded. A heavy and rusty door seemed to be opening, and we were finally seeing a ray of light illuminating the path to achieve our goal. Whether we can actually widely open this door depends on decision by national governments, as well as by the action of citizens urging ratification on their government. To achieve the entry into force of the treaty and to progress further toward the goal of establishing a world without nuclear. We, the Hibakusha, though our days are numbered, pledge to use all our remaining strength to work together with you. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much. A very, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to friends around the world. We just heard Wada Masaka, who mentioned in today's world of 14,500 nuclear weapons, that who used and created atomic bombs are absolutely unpardonable, in her words. Our next speaker is from Costa Rica. It's a country in Central America and is known as the only country in the world without an army. Can you imagine that? A world without an army. In fact, Costa Rica in 1949, the military was abolished, and 1st December is celebrated as Military Abolition Day. We have the amazing Dr. Carlos Umana, who is a doctor and the regional vice president of the Latin American International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Dr. Umana, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bina, and to everybody, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I have the honor today of speaking on behalf of IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the founding member of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which I also represent. We're living in challenging times. In the midst of a global health and economic crisis that has the world in lockdown, we are coming to terms with several harsh realities, including the vulnerability of the current global system. We must be clear, however, that although a virus sparked this crisis, it is political in origin, not biological. It stems from governments dismissing and ignoring the warnings made by scientists and medical professionals throughout the world. The most important lesson that society must learn from this pandemic is that science must not be ignored. And science has, time and again, issued detailed warnings regarding nuclear weapons. With nuclear weapons, however, the stakes are much higher. Healthcare professionals have, for decades, outlined the humanitarian consequences of nuclear detonations and pointed out the risks inherent to the existing nuclear arsenals. As we have just learned from Wada-san's testimony, these are no ordinary bombs. The devastation caused by these uniquely destructive weapons would involve both space and time. Cities would become inaccessible and uninhabitable for long periods of time. And the atrocious effects of acute and chronic radiation would not only affect survivors throughout their lives with various cancers and chronic illnesses, but also their progeny, who will have a high risk of severe genetic and birth defects, as well as a higher risk of cancer. There is no possibility of first response, as most healthcare workers will have died, most hospitals, clinic, and communication infrastructure will have been destroyed, and the radiation will make it impossible for external first responders to aid the victims of a nuclear detonation. Victims with injuries, burns, and the painful manifestation of acute radiation syndrome will be left to suffer and die alone. Moreover, a high-altitude nuclear explosion would create an electromagnetic pulse that would disrupt most electrical devices within a radius far greater than the physical devastation from the nuclear blast, causing widespread failure of automobiles, computers, telephones, and telecommunications. The world, as we know it, will radically change. Climate scientists have determined that a limited nuclear war, one caused by 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons detonated in cities in a war between India and Pakistan, would not only cause several million deaths and injuries, but that the soot and debris that rise to the atmosphere will rapidly reduce the temperature in the biosphere, affecting the production of staple grains, rice, wheat, corn, and soy, resulting in a famine that would kill around 2 billion people worldwide, mostly from economically challenged countries, many of them far away from where the original conflict took place. The scarcity of food supplies and the ensuing price speculation will increase the likelihood of armed conflicts and perhaps even a full-scale nuclear war, which, aside from killing dozens of millions of people, would generate a nuclear winter through which many species, maybe even our own, could become extinct. Recovery from a full-scale nuclear war would be impossible. The only sensible path is to prevent it. Scientists have also told us that the risk that this will occur is ever greater. The doomsday clock, created by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, is a symbolic clock that measures a global man-made catastrophe in minutes to midnight, marks, for 2020, 100 seconds to midnight, the highest risk in history. This is mainly due to the incendiary rhetoric of leaders of nuclear countries and the ease with which they make nuclear threats, the growing climate crisis and its potential for generating and aggravating conflict, and the ever-growing risk of accidental nuclear detonations and technological warfare. Now, over 1,000 accidents have been recorded with the US nuclear arsenal alone, 6 of which have nearly resulted in nuclear war. Of the nearly 14,000 nuclear warheads in the current global arsenal, approximately 1,800 remain in a state of high alert, pointing at cities ready to be detonated within minutes. The high technological dependence makes high alert systems vulnerable to cyber attacks and to human and technical error. This risk is so great that scientists in the Future of Life Institute have determined that the most likely nuclear war is an accidental one. If we are alive today, it is due to luck rather than to good management of these arsenals. If we're not willing to bet that this luck will last forever, then we must work actively towards eliminating the nuclear threat, and we must do so urgently. Now, as weapons, nuclear weapons are not practical. Their effects cannot be controlled. They do not respect borders. They are not made to destroy military targets, but to destroy cities and kill many civilians. Using them would be a suicidal act, so they cannot really be used in warfare. The sole reason for possessing them is the threat they represent, the semantic charge behind the words nuclear power and nuclear deterrence. Nuclear weapons thus function in the sense as a symbol, the construction of which has been supported and maintained not only by the 9 nuclear weapon states and their allies, but by the entire world, both actively and passively, until recently. On July the 7th, 2017, at the UN in New York, 122 countries, a clear majority of the international community, voted in favor of adopting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. This treaty prohibits the development, testing, production, stockpiling, stationing, transfer, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. This is the product of the collective empowerment of non-nuclear weapon states and of them assuming an active role as stakeholders in the nuclear weapons issue. This refreshing new way of conducting international politics that was coined by a Costa Rican diplomat in the UN as the democratization of nuclear disarmament fosters cooperation and strengthens the multilateral regime, which are necessary ingredients to effectively face humanity's pressing challenges. Moreover, the TPNW aims to stigmatize nuclear weapons through prohibition, a strategy that history has proven to be effective, and the process by which all other weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, landmines, and cluster munitions, have been abolished. Currently, there are no states boasting of being chemical weapons power or of using biological weapons in their security doctrine. This is because a strong international norm and a climate of moral condemnation have been effective in making these claims taboo. And this is precisely how this treaty is starting to take effect, even before its entry into force. Nowadays, power and prestige are less associated to destructive power, impositions, and threats, and ever more associated to the ability to create dialogue, build bridges, and come to agreements. The threat of imminent nuclear war makes less sense than ever right now. And in light of the world's current crisis, spending the yearly sum of $116 billion in the maintenance and modernization of the world's nuclear arsenal is beyond ludicrous. It is urgent to give peace a chance. It is urgent to move towards nuclear disarmament and ban nuclear weapons. The failure to threat the failure to face the threat posed by COVID-19 turned out to be disastrous. But the continued negligence of governments and similarly ignoring the nuclear threat will be far worse. The silver lining with this pandemic is that humanity has a chance to finally open its eyes to the warnings of science, to the latent risk of catastrophe that we are in, and to the urgent need for cooperation and peace. Our plea to policymakers is to be on the right side of history, to be on the side of science, evidence, and common sense. The alternative, as we now know all too well, is catastrophe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That's was a very powerful speech. Also to announce that we do have the text of some of the speeches, and we will be sharing that on our website as well if you'd like to read through them. I am really excited to announce our next speaker, Jade Bastida, who is a Mexican and Chilean American climate activist. She is part of the core committee of Fridays for Future New York City, and we are so glad to have her. So welcome, Jade.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making this space for me to be here today. I thank all of you for listening to this very important topic. My name is Jade Bastida, and I'm an 18-year-old climate justice activist. I have been working in the climate justice space for about 1 year now at the level of national and international organizing. I organized the September 20th climate strike in New York City, which brought over 300,000 people to the streets. And now I'm working on turning all the campaigns digital. Something about me is that I was born in Mexico and I was raised as part of the Otomi Toltec indigenous philosophy and indigenous peoples. My parents, growing up, they told me, you know, indigenous philosophy is important because that says we take care of the earth because the earth takes care of us. We have to be reciprocal. We have to give what we take. And that thinking is what has guided me through all of my climate justice activism. And for me, what that means for me in terms of nuclear weapons is this. I think that the reason for humans to feel like they need to have this type of power, because nuclear weapons translate to the power that you can have. And it's a type of unhealthy power. For me, what healthy power means is the interconnectedness that nature shows us. So if you look at the planet, all the ecosystems are balanced, and that is power for nature. And we as humans have desensitized ourselves from the power that we could have with nature, that positive type of power. And instead we have resorted to threatening and destroying ourselves, which is not only going to affect our environment if we keep on the route of fossil fuels, but also our civilizations if we keep on the route of nuclear weapons. And in terms of the environmental effects of nuclear weapons, as I'm sure a lot of you can imagine, it would be truly devastating. As per the World Health Organization, water supplies would be contaminated not only by radioactivity, but also by pathogenic bacteria and viruses. And what this time shows us, the time of the coronavirus pandemic, is that we cannot afford to have a system that doesn't treat people who are sick right away or right to avoid another pandemic. And in a scenario of nuclear deterrence, this would be exacerbated, as we have heard before. Sewage treatment and waste disposal facilities would have almost completely disappeared. We would lose a lot of the stability of our society. And in a lot of my work in climate activism, most of it centers around justice for communities that are the most affected by the climate crisis. Frontline communities, such as indigenous communities and Black and Brown communities in spaces like New York City, which I am in right now, in which 17% of adults have asthma in the Bronx, which is 10% higher than the national average. For me, what that means is that climate justice means social justice in a lot of senses, not only in the ways in which you can most rapidly know what the race of a group is, depending on whether or not it's close to a fossil fuel industry plant or something like that. And for me, I think that when we get into such a conflict like nuclear conflict, obviously the most affected are going to be frontline communities. And it's going to exacerbate the social gap, the social instability in our systems. And if I am trying to prevent the climate crisis to do those kind of things on our society, I also have to pay attention to the other threats that could cause instability in our society, which is why I have decided to come up on here and talk to you from a perspective of a youth who is worried about the instability that may arise from a crisis like this. And there's like a lot of statistics, as we have heard today, such as, our ozone layer would be depleted by 40% in most of the world and up to 70% in the poles. This would cause dramatic environmental effects as well as dramatic social effects. And the same as always, those with money and power are going to be the ones who will be able to maybe run away from this crisis for a short time, if anything. And just going back on the topic of why I interconnect this with climate justice is because the reason why we are in a climate catastrophe is because of the greed and because of the insensitivity that a lot of us humans have put into the system, corruption. And that ties in with why we are also wanting to have weapons of mass destruction to show the power that a lot of people want to have. So my message for this panel of people from all around the world who are watching us is that the youth obviously want to see a better future for us and all of us on our planet, not only in the sense of climate justice, but also in the sense of security from the anxiety that comes from the possibility of a nuclear war. Because if we're trying to fight so hard for climate justice because of the things that might happen to our world, because of everything that is still going on, we also need to be part of this conversation in the sense of we want to protect the world, we want to protect the future, we want to protect you, and we want you to protect us. This has to be an intergenerational conversation now more than ever. And I think that all social issues have to be intergenerational conversations because we are at a tipping point in which my generation is going to be the most affected by the actions that adults take. So with that, I want to thank all of the panelists that have already gone and all of the ones who are going to come on because I am learning a lot. And I know I still have more to learn, but I wanted to bring my perspective from a climate justice perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zie. Your voice as an Indigenous youth. Thank you, Zie. Your voice as an Indigenous youth is so important, and you're bringing us that angle here in this World Conference. As we all aware that mining uranium contaminates Indigenous societies and severely affects the health of its residents, and a large-scale, highly radioactive waste materials are mostly stored in vulnerable communities of color. So it is really important that we involve the youth, we involve many Indigenous and marginalized communities in this fight. Our next speaker is Mr. Hiroshi Taka from Japan. Hiroshi Taka is a representative director of the Japan Council Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs. As we know, Japan is the country which has seen these attacks in the past, but it is also a great learning experience that Japan is also the only country in the world which has renounced war to resolve international conflict. So welcome, Hiroshi Taka. The floor is all yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Behind me, you can see a tapestry on which the poem. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you, yes.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. I start from the beginning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Behind me, you can see a tapestry on which the poem of Toge Sankichi entitled Give Me Back My People is stitched. A woman activist in Kyoto sent it to me, wanting to show it to you to convey the Japanese grassroots voices through this conference. Some 75 years ago, the lives of 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki were lost, and many more people were exposed to radiation. The number of the dead in Hiroshima was as many as the number of the people who have died of COVID-19 now. His poem represented the desire for never again atomic bombings. The nuclear powers still possess over 14,000 nuclear warheads, lying that their arsenals are to prevent nuclear war or the guarantee of security. They are even developing new nuclear weapons and modernizing their whole arsenals in the midst of human crisis. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued an urgent appeal for the immediate halt to armed conflict and to engage in the struggle against the pandemic that is devastating our world. We too should call on the nuclear powers, particularly the nuclear five, that hold the permanent seats in the UN Security Council as well as the nuclear-dependent countries, to refrain from the threat or use of force in resolving international conflicts, to implement the first resolution of the UN General Assembly, which pledged to eliminate atomic and other weapons of mass destruction, and to redirect the resources to the protection of the humans and their globe, for peace, to halt to the climate change, filling the economic gap, and for the improvement of social welfare, medical services, and education. On this very day, we of Gensuikyo were supposed to be attending the World Conference in New York with 1,000 people, 1,000 delegates. And tomorrow, we plan to submit millions of signatures in support of the international appeal of the Hibakusha for a ban and elimination of nuclear weapons to the United Nations and the NPT Review Conference. These actions were necessarily cancelled. Yet the efforts we made are not in vain. We formed a broad coalition to collect signatures, and the number of the people who signed the Hiroshima appeal, Hibakusha appeal, has surpassed 10 million. The mayors who have appended their signatures now represent 70% of the 1,720 Japanese municipalities, and 448 local assemblies passed resolutions urging the national government to sign and ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Please look forward to hearing a report from Mr. Tanaka, representative of the Hidankyo. He will deliver the report at the end of today's session. At present, because of COVID-19, the pace of these efforts is slowing down. Our nationwide peace march, which usually has 100,000 participants, is cancelled in many places, or will be changed to silent symbolic actions. But we want to turn this adversity into opportunities to learn to use new media as well as long-tested traditional media to strengthen our communication with the public. While superpowers continue their rivalry, failing even to take a common stand to address the current pandemic, people are rapidly learning that the problems facing the human race can't be resolved by my country first principle or our national security first politics, and that cooperation is the only answer. Solidarity between the anti-nuclear peace movement and diverse movements for environment and social and economic justice is developing as seen in this online conference. If people cooperate worldwide, COVID-19 will be finally subdued, and the next NPT Review Conference will take place in or before next April. So that it will be successful, we have a homework. We must generate changes in our own countries, especially those which possess or rely on nuclear weapons, by building majority voices for the implementation of Article 6 of NPT and related past agreements, including the obligation of the total elimination of the nuclear arsenals, which they have promised. We are determined to make every effort to transform Japan to a country that will stand in the forefront in order to bring the TPNW into force, as Japan is the only able country that makes it the constitutional principle to renounce war and war potentials as a means to resolve international conflict. It is possible, as seen in the fact that in the survey conducted in December last year, when Pope Francisco called for Japan to enter into the treaty, 65.9% answered, yes, it should. In August, we mark the 70th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With the aging of the Hibakusha, the initiative of our movement against A and H bombs is important to continue preventing nuclear war, banning and eliminating nuclear weapons, and extending support and solidarity with the nuclear victims. So we have agreed among us to host the 2020 World Conference against A and H bombs on August the 6th and 9th as an online conference. It will be a conference that will bring together voices and actions of people at grassroots who act for a nuclear weapon-free, peaceful, and just world. It will extend solidarity with all who want to save the humans and the planet. And it will invite representatives of both grassroots movement and national and local governments who stand for the same goal as our speakers. At the same time, we are planning to launch an international joint action, Peace Wave, which will start in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and circle around the globe at the speed of the Earth's rotation. It will be a chain linking many creative grassroots actions with one common goal, abolition of nuclear weapons, and one common form of action in support of the Hibakusha appeal. I hope by then COVID-19 will be subdued, but even if it is not, we'll find various forms of actions that fit for our respective conditions. In April 2015, 5 years ago, when we presented millions of signatures to the United Nations and the last NPT review conference at the Hammarskjöld Plaza, the then chair of the conference, Taus Faruqi, emphasized that the effort to globally involve ordinary citizens was essential to reaching our goal. And she was right. To achieve success in abolishing nuclear weapons, saving the Earth, overcoming the pandemic, or winning in any other important cause, decisions and actions taken by the people are decisive. Let us continue our action for it, creatively and undauntedly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taka-san. That was a wonderful speech and perfectly on time, so always appreciated. Our next speaker you've already heard from, he gave our welcome. Joseph Gerson is, unsurprisingly, one of the lead organizers of this World Conference. He's also president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and the Disarmament Coordinator for the American Friends Service Committee, and vice president of the International Peace Bureau. So I'm honored and excited to welcome Joseph back to the screen to give his speech.
Thank you, Emily. Pandemics, like wars, accelerate profound structural changes that were already in motion. The structures of the world disorder and the imbalance of political, military, and economic power are now in the process of being decisively changed. COVID-19's impacts will be on the order of the First World War and the Great Depression. COVID-19 has undermined the neoliberal assault. People across the world are turning to their governments for desperately needed health services and financial support. The pandemic is thus strengthening state power and nationalism. With COVID-19 claiming tens, potentially hundreds of thousands of lives of poor and low-wage workers, immigrants, and people of color.
Sorry, Joseph, we can't see you.
Okay. I do here, sorry.
You're good. The joys of a virtual conference.
Sorry about that. Okay, with COVID-19 claiming tens, potentially thousands of lives of poor, low-wage workers, immigrants, and people of color, the reality of glaring and deadly injustices and structural violence has become unavoidable. Unanswered is whether the power of oligarchies and plutocracies will be successfully challenged or further crystallized. We must do all that we can to ensure that, unlike Germany in the early 1930s, the severe economic dislocations don't generate 21st century fascism. In the near term, the pandemic reinforces authoritarian regimes. Across the world, new laws and edicts allow governments to detain people indefinitely and infringe on freedoms of assembly and expression. In the US, fear and confinement to our homes create what Hannah Arendt described as the essential conditions for imposition of totalitarianism. This is not an inevitable outcome. It depends on what we do. Donald Trump claimed that he has absolute power, total authority. In much the same way that he extorted the Ukrainian government, Trump is attempting to bend state governments to his will by withholding essential medical equipment and sicking arms demonstrators on state capitals. He fired the Pentagon and National Intelligence Inspector Generals, who played important roles in protecting constitutional limits on the exercise of coercive power and prevention of corruption. Attorney General Barr has transformed the Department of Justice into the tyrant's sword and shield. And Trump and his allies are doing all they can to prevent free and fair elections in November. Elsewhere, Chinese repression and lies initially fueled the pandemic, but Beijing's total lockdown, advanced surveillance technologies, and police state methods apparently contain the virus, even as it spreads globally. Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Duterte in the Philippines, and others are using the virus to reinforce their dictatorial powers. Meanwhile, the geopolitical struggle for regional and world power continues under the existential threats of nuclear weapons and the climate emergency. It also takes place within the context of the Thucydides trap, the tragic history of major wars growing out of the inevitable tensions between rising and declining powers. US power and influence have been in decline since the Vietnam War, a dynamic accelerated by the Bush, Obama, and Trump wars. Beijing is seen as Washington's peer competitor with growing economic, military, diplomatic, and soft power influence across Asia, the global South, and increasingly in Europe. Trump's America First disregard and alienation of allies have accelerated the US decline. Stephen Walt at Harvard has written that the coronavirus will accelerate the shift of power and influence from the West to the East. Certainly with failed pandemic responses in Europe and the US, the power of the Western brand has diminished. In Europe, the centrifugal forces weakening the EU have also been reinforced, just as Germany and France are seeking to transform the EU into a major military, potentially nuclear power. National boundaries have again been raised to limit the spread of the virus. In Hungary, Orban blocked the essential transportation route across the continent, and Northern European nations provided scant pandemic assistance to Italy and Spain, opening the way for greater Chinese influence. For a generation, the Washington consensus has been the imperative of containing China. Recall that Obama launched the pivot to Asia and the Trans-Pacific Partnership to contain China militarily and economically. Today, Trump and the GOP are engaged in a new Cold War with China. They have made China their scapegoat to deflect attention from their cold-hearted and calculated pandemic failures and to prevail in November's elections. A coven of China hawks, is also pushing to punish and challenge China with new sanctions, mandates for domestic manufacturing, and controls on American exports. The pandemic also provides impetus for the Trump-Navarro campaign to decouple the US and the Chinese economies. The Chinese state and its mega corporations are hardly innocents. China has claimed sovereignty over 80% of the South China Sea at the expense of other nations. It has engaged in massive intellectual property theft, and its ghastly human rights violations cannot be ignored. Nonetheless, as Simon Tisdall of The Guardian wrote, the virus has become a Chinese soft power tool to overtake its superpower rival. The Pentagon is also boosting its forces in Asia and the Pacific. The strategic force driving the $100 billion increase in Pentagon spending has been the development and deployment of new nuclear weapon systems and other weapon systems in order to maintain US military superiority over China. The Trump administration has failed to provide essential medical equipment in this time of need, but it has no problem seeking an extra $20 billion to increase naval forces confronting China. After withdrawing from the INF treaty with Russia, amidst the Trump-Putin competition in deploying usable battlefield nuclear weapons in Europe, intermediate range missiles are being deployed in the Western Pacific. Sorry to say there is more. Assuming that UN Secretary General Guterres's call for global ceasefire doesn't apply to them, the Chinese and US navies are challenging one another in disputes in the South China Sea. China recently conducted air and naval drills near Taiwan. The US responded with a massive display of B-52 bombers in Guam. And not to be left out, last week a Russian pilot intercepted a US warplane over the Mediterranean, and Moscow continues its so-called limited action interventions in Ukraine, Syria, and Libya. China has been strategic in providing medical assistance, even As the US and China exchange accusations about responsibility for the pandemic, there has been cooperation. In December, China shared the virus genetic code with US authorities, and it has provided PPEs and ventilators to New York. Beijing also sent medical experts and equipment to Italy and Spain, which also serves to increase its influence in Europe as part of China's Belt and Road Eurasia integration project. Meanwhile, seeing no advantage in aiding Pakistan and Iran, countries already dependent on China, little or no assistance had flowed their way. Friends, the pandemic, amidst its horrors, also opens opportunities. As Arundhati Roy wrote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. The pandemic teaches that we are a single interdependent species, and that military first and xenophobic policies threaten our security and survival. This is a moment to revive the concept of common security, the paradigm that served as the foundation for ending the Cold War. Its essence is that achieving mutual survival requires diplomacy, leading to win-win agreements that de-escalate tensions, result in downward spirals of arms races, enhance mutual security, and bring more justice into the world. Today, common security diplomacy urgently needs focus on cooperation in the development and distribution of pandemic cures and vaccines, on reduction of great power tensions, elimination of nuclear weapons, support for Secretary General Guterres's call for a global ceasefire, creating a sustainable climate, and securing economic and social justice. Friends, we have much work to do, even as we are largely confined to our homes, not the least being defending democracy. Let's dig in and help forge humanity's way forward. Thank you so much, and on we go.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your presentation. I think you have really touched on the view of what is happening with rising authoritarian regimes around the world and the nuclear use. In fact, there are over 2,000 nuclear tests that have happened around the world. And this is a great, great source of concern. Friends, thank you so much for tuning from around the world for this probably the first global conference, world conference on abolishing of nuclear weapons and looking at climate change and our social and economic justice. And it has come at a very apt time where we are all staying indoors because of the pandemic, and we have a role to play there. So we are now transitioning to panel 2. While the panel 1, we had a focus on the abolition of how nuclear weapons. We had friends from Japan, Costa Rica, United States, and Mexico and other parts speaking about what is happening. And now we will be going into panel 2, which is looking at what are the action steps and what are our priorities. So take a minute just to take a breathing, and then we'll just be back in a second. Thank you. So we have our second panel, action steps and priorities. And our first speaker is of panel 2 is Reverend Liz Theoharis. She is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. And she has the Poor People's Campaign started in 1968 in an attempt to gain economic justice for the poor people in the United States. So we have a very, very critical presentation here, and the campaign had demanded economic and human rights for the poor in the United States. So we have Reverend Liz Theoharis, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And good day and evening to everybody that has joined. It is an honor to address this international conference. I was raised by a family that was very active in the anti-nuclear movement, who followed the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, peace is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. I was impacted by the Bible quote in Jeremiah, my people are broken, shattered, and yet they put on Band-Aids, saying it's not so bad, you'll be just fine, but things are not just fine. Our leaders say peace, peace, when there is no peace. We live in a time and in an economic system in the United States and across the world that values our lives relative to our ability to produce profits for the rich. Our wellness is measured by our efficiency, and a particular lesson in the age of coronavirus, our sickness, when it's considered at all, is seen as an indication of individual limitations or moral failures, rather than a symptom of a sick society, ill with violence and war, sick with racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the war economy, sick with the distorted moral narrative of religious, especially Christian nationalism. There are about 87 million uninsured and underinsured people in the United States. 62 million workers make less than a living wage. 15 million families can't afford water, and 4 million have water that is poisoned. There are upwards of 11 million homeless people in this country. And although the United States doesn't have a military draft, we have a poverty draft where many young people have no potential of getting an education or stable employment without joining the military. Thousands of communities across the country are contaminated by petrochemical companies, industrial waste, and raw sewage, all made worse by climate change and the militarization and destruction of the earth. Using the United States Census Bureau's supplemental poverty measure, there are at least 140 million people who are poor, or just one small emergency away from poverty. That's nearly half the US population. It's family farmers who live in food deserts with rural hospitals closing. It's moms who have had to bury their children, not because God called them home, but because they have no health care in a country that spends more on healthcare than any other. There are teenagers whose homeless encampments have been bulldozed by the police and by white supremacist militia. Native American lands whose sacred lands are being mined by multinational extractors. According to an audit that the Poor People's Campaign put together some years ago called The Souls of Poor Folk, the poor and low income today consist of 24 million Black Americans, 38 million Latino Americans, 8 million Asian Americans, 2 million Native people, and 66 million white people. These staggering numbers, already a deadweight for the nation, are likely to prove a grotesque underestimate in this coronavirus world. But none of this should be a surprise. In the last few decades, unemployment and underemployment, poverty, and homelessness have become ever more deeply and permanently structured into this society. And over the years, one political narrative has been trumpeted by both parties in the United States, that we don't have enough to provide for everyone. This scarcity argument has undergirded every federal budget in recent history, and yet it falls flat when we look at the 53% of every federal discretionary dollar that goes to the United States Pentagon, the trillions of dollars that have been squandered in this country's never-ending war on terror, not to speak of the unprecedented financial gains the wealthiest have made, even in the midst of this current crisis. When the coronavirus first became a national emergency, the US Federal Reserve materialized more than $1.5 trillion for Wall Street. And in the weeks that have followed, we've funneled a congressional bipartisan stimulus series of packages have funneled trillions more into the largest corporations, but tens of millions of Americans are being left out. Such emissions are guaranteed to prove debilitating, even potentially lethal for many. They also represent cracks in a dam ready to break in a nation without a guaranteed living wage or universal health care as debts mount wages stagnate, and the pressures of ecological devastation and the climate change intensify. The dual crises of pandemic and inequality, alongside war and the destruction of the earth, are revealing ever more clearly how the descent into poverty is helping to destroy US society from the inside out. In a remarkably brief span of time, these crises have also highlighted our collective interdependence. Isn't it time to demand a transformative moral agenda that reaches from the bottom up? 75 years after the whole-scale destruction wrought by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, isn't it time now for peace and for justice? If the United States shrank our war economy, eliminating nuclear weapons and cutting US military bases in countries across the world, if the United States had fair taxes for the rich and corporations, if we invested in healthcare and living wages and a guaranteed income and decent and affordable housing, strong programs for the poor, we could indeed end poverty. We could turn our war economy into a peace economy. This crisis is offering us a striking demonstration of how an economy oriented around the whims of the rich and the drums of war brings death and destruction in its wake. A society organized around the needs of the poor, on the other hand, can improve life for all of us. And this, in this moment, might be possible. This is why the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is building power among the 140 million poor and low-income people in the United States and building bridges with movements of the poor around the world. In 2018, we organized the largest wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the US in the 21st century. We're organized in more than 43 states across the United States, have 16 national faith bodies and 100 labor unions and partner organizations that are a part of this campaign of the poor. We have put together a poor people's moral budget and presented it to the House of Representatives and are trying to present it to the United Nations. We're engaging in mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for a movement that votes. The Poor People's Campaign has the understanding that to address poverty, we must simultaneously address 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. We've seen in US history, whenever we face the forces of regression, that moral movements arise to call us to higher ground. It's what the abolitionists did in the 19th century, the women's suffragists did in the early 20th century. It's what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s when Rosa Parks and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and many other grassroots moral leaders of every race, creed, class, color, and sexuality did when they built the US civil rights movement. And it's what people called us to in the Poor People's Campaign, challenging the nation to address racism and poverty and militarism. In every generation, we've needed a fusion movement where people come together through our deepest moral values to build an agenda and organize, organize, organize. There is a moral uprising, a new and unsettling force of people who refuse to give up and refuse to settle and surrender to suffering. And so the Poor People's Campaign is organizing a mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington that will be online on June 20th, 2020. Dr. King said in the last year of his life, power for poor people will really mean having the assertiveness, the aggressiveness, and the together to make the power structures of this nation say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. Please join us across the world for the Poor People's Campaign. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Liz, for tying all of our issues together and bringing up how vital it is that we're fighting the war economy and making sure that we're creating a movement that really works for everyone, especially people currently living in poverty. So thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Imad Kiei, who is director and co-founder of the Middle East Treaty Organization. So welcome, Imad.
Thank you so much. Greetings to everyone joining us from across the world. Minasan konnichiwa. I would like to recognize the organizers and co-sponsors of this timely event. Thank you, Joseph and Mariana and your team for the important work. The socioeconomic and political consequences of the coronavirus pandemic are bringing humanity to a crossroad. Either we continue on the path towards steeper inequality, injustice, and environmental catastrophe, or by renewing our commitment for collective action, we build a world free of nuclear weapons, without wars, with global social and environmental justice inscribed here today. The Middle East is a good example for this rule. It has all the ingredients to play a constructive role in this process: strategic location, plentiful natural resources, and a millennial-old cultures with a fearless, youthful demographic striving to transform the region for the better. Yet, it also holds the ingredients to foster and spread destruction and discord, with an added toxic dose of ethnic, sectarian, national, and religious fanaticism. The grand-scale transformation we are witnessing today provides a rare opportunity to rethink and expand the realm of what is possible, how we can get there, and who can help us along the way, and why the time to act is now. Let us begin our journey to rid the Middle East from all weapons of mass destruction as a gateway towards regional cooperation on peace and security. This will build bridges for cooperation on wider cross-border environmental, social, and economic challenges. We know that weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, threaten the survival of our human family and planet. But nowhere it is more urgent to rid and stem their spread than in the Middle East. Luckily, we do not have to start from scratch. We do need to re-energize and reformulate the process to realize the decades-old idea of establishing a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. An idea first proposed by Egypt more than 30 years ago with support from Iran. We need to base this process on the principles of cooperation, trust, and goodwill, undoing the current animosity among regional countries that have crippled the drive towards peace, security, and prosperity. Thus, the WMD-free zone will not only contribute to strengthening non-proliferation efforts, it will also open the discussion to broader challenges facing the region. And the bottom line is this: we need a treaty negotiated through an inclusive process by all 22 Arab countries in the Middle East and Africa, in addition to Iran and Israel, with the support of world powers. We will then need to establish a regional organization to oversee the treaty's eventual implementation. The good news is that there are multiple initiatives currently underway to support the realization of the zone. The traditional track linked to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT's indefinite extension in 1995, requiring the international community to support the establishment of the zone. Regrettably, though, there has been very little progress since then on the treaty text or on establishing a regional organization. A more promising complementary diplomatic process has started recently. It is known as the United Nations Conference on the WMD-free zone. Its first meeting was held in November 2019 with participation from all 22 Arab countries, but also included Iran and the permanent members of the UN Security Council, with the notable absence of Israel and the US. But don't worry, because this conference will happen annually until a final treaty text is negotiated through an inclusive consensus-based drive. So we can hopefully see Israel and the United States participate in the future conferences. We know that these diplomatic processes take a long time. But as civil society, we don't have to wait. We have the flexibility and freedom to take action now. And that is exactly what a group of civil society activists, academics, and dreamers, which I'm part of, from within the region and beyond started doing. We went ahead and wrote an evolving and adaptive draft treaty text and established a preparatory organization named the Middle East Treaty Organization, or META. The draft treaty text and META, bolstered by our citizen diplomacy, advocacy, civil society organization partnerships, are already galvanizing governments and broader civil society organizations across the region and beyond to imagine what is possible and how they can play a part in shaping the path forward. All of this, of course, requires us to have a reality check. We are not naive. We're far too familiar with the formidable obstacles on our path forward, from the combination of lingering disagreements over the process of how and when to achieve the zone, to the broader weapons of mass destruction, proliferation risks, and geopolitical realities facing the region. Let me just throw in a few examples. These include Israel's nuclear weapons monopoly and efforts by major Middle Eastern countries to level the playing field through their own ongoing efforts to expand their WMD capabilities. The multiple cases of chemical weapons use in Syria since the 2011 uprising and struggles to eliminate those stockpiles and bring those responsible to justice. We also have regional destabilization in the wake of the US wars with Iraq and Afghanistan and the Arab Spring that has created an opportunity for extremists and terrorist groups to flourish and contribute to WMD proliferation. Finally, the fragility of the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and the world powers followed President Trump's 2018 unilateral withdrawal, reinstating previously removed sanctions, but also introducing ever more draconian sanctions on the country, on my country, has crippled the Iranian economy and inflicted collective punishment on over 18 million Iranians. This above challenges that are dealing with WMDs also exists alongside broader political tensions that are happening in the region and complicate the progress towards the zone. These security challenges include the role of world powers in militarizing the Middle East, the means of war, with the US and Russia contributing for a lion's share of weapon sales and military aid to their respective allies in the region. We also have regional rivalries between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which complicates the situation. In addition, the previous failures to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli and wider Arab-Israeli conflicts continue to sow distrust and provide fodder for radicalization in the Middle East. The series of uprisings that swept the Arab world from Tunisia to Syria and their messy aftermath are also disrupting the geopolitical configurations of the region. So this is the reality that we face. But let us move forward. By reducing proliferation risks, achieving a WMD-free zone can renew regional efforts to tackle these deep-rooted challenges that I just mentioned. The zone will require regional countries to build closer lines of communication, reduce tensions and mistrust, thus cultivating a new beginning in multilateral and bilateral relations. These refreshed geopolitical realities will allow us to unlock the positive social, economic, and cultural potential of the region. With renewed hope from improved regional relations, excessive spending currently on defense will be diminished, freeing up vast financial resources and human resources for high-impact human development that we need. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity for a call for action. This pandemic has shown us that we are truly connected and our actions have ripple effects throughout the world. The path we take today will determine on a larger scale the fate of our human family. The injustice, insecurity, and carnage that have shaken the Middle East, therefore, will continue to manifest in many forms on all levels of our society. Inaction is no longer an option. And if we truly seek to realize the noble goals inscribed here today, the world free from nuclear weapons, without wars, with global social and environmental justice, we need all to be on the same boat. So I call upon all of you to join us, to learn more and connect with us by visiting Metode's website at wmd-free.me. But I will also share that with you later. I'm sure the organizers will facilitate that for us. But your solidarity, your support and engagement helps us to become stronger and resilient in the face of those seemingly powerful naysayers that cast doubts on what we can achieve. So I thank you for your time, and I hope that we can forge a path forward towards achieving these noble goals that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Imad Giai, for your excellent presentation and your view on the Middle East and the work that needs to be done on your clarion call. This session is about looking at strategies, and many of the questions which are coming in, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will be taking them later. So I think it's on strategies right now, and many of us have spoken about the expenditure of nuclear weapons, which is rising to about $105 billion annually, compared to $12 million, $10 million for an entire year, which is spent by the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs. So I think there's this huge gap of trillions of money spent in militarization is what we got to. We have a wonderful speaker now joining us. Her name is Sharon Burrow, and the critical importance of looking at the marginalized, looking at gender is a very critical element of how gender issues link in with the work on nuclear disarmament and for climate change. So here Sharon is the first woman to become a part of the first woman leader of the world's largest international trade union organization. She is the Secretary General of the International Trade Union Federation. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you who are giving up your Saturday afternoon for such a critical issue. So greetings and solidarity in this global crisis. COVID-19 as a pandemic has taken some 200,000 lives already, and many more will suffer lasting health effects. Shutdowns and confinement cover most of the world's population. So we are living through an historic act of global solidarity where people have given up civic freedoms to prevent loss of lives, and where millions of frontline workers in health and vital services go to work, risking their own health and that of their families to allow the rest of us to survive in isolation. On May 1, that historic Workers' Day, around the world we will salute these workers, but we will also call for a new social contract as the basis for recovery and resilience. This will require redesign of our world to ensure that people and planet are at the center of a peaceful world where prosperity is shared. We already faced a convergence of crisis. Conflict is escalating with a military spend and numbers of refugees greater than World War II. We have a massive inequality that was driving an age of anger and a distrust in our democracies. The climate emergency is an imperative for action to save human beings from extinction, and progress on every indicator for women has stalled. We are facing the choices associated with the best and worst of technology, and now we have COVID-19 and the very real potential for up to 200 million jobs lost, up to 250 million people facing starvation, and potentially some 500 million people thrown back into poverty. This requires us to push the reset button on our world to ensure a just transition to a better future, a future where peace is a foundation for hope. We need a new social contract to deliver peace and stability, but we cannot build a new social contract under the terror of the threat of war and nuclear attacks. War and weapons, nuclear weapons are the antithesis of what the trade union movement stands for. Democratic decision-making and peaceful negotiations are cornerstones of our movement, and of course, that Human Rights and Labour Rights Convention of freedom of association and the right to bargain collectively. We cannot start building peace and prosperity if we don't lower our arms. The ITUC supports UN Secretary General Guterres' call for a global ceasefire to help create corridors for life-saving aid, open windows for diplomacy, and to bring hope to places where the most vulnerable are actually suffering from COVID-19. We need to make sure, though, that that call does not go away, because human memory can be short-lived. And our Japanese affiliate, the JTC Rengo, have throughout our history as a movement kept the memory of the injustice of the atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima alive. It is shameful that after 75 years of these tragic acts of war, we continue to face this man-made evil. In readiness for the NPT review conference, which must be held as soon as possible, JTUC Ringo, together with Gensukin and Kakan, have already gathered almost 8.2 million signatures in a petition calling for nuclear disarmament. The risk of nuclear weapons is at its highest in decades. There are currently around 2,000 tons of nuclear materials for weapons stored in some 40 countries, enough to make 40,000 bombs the size of the one that devastated Hiroshima. And we know that indeed nuclear expenditure is expanding even in developed economies or across the continent of Europe. And then, of course, you have the corporate world pushing its social responsibility aside when profits are to be made with weapons of mass destruction. Corporate greed fuels the arms race and pushes politicians to service that greed and private interest rather than people's safety. If you consider that the Pentagon wants to spend 1.2 trillion to upgrade its nuclear arsenal, Russia spends an estimated 10 billion a year, and the collapse of the INF Treaty may well have started a new nuclear arms race, then just imagine investing 1.2 trillion or more in healthcare, education, jobs in other areas of care for people, and universal social protection for all the world's people to build resilience in the next crisis. The Global Days of Action on Military Spending in 2020 brings attention to the vast opportunity costs of the current levels of military spending. $1.8 trillion a year, almost 5 billion per day. You put that against the ITUC's call, supported even by employers globally, for a global fund for universal social protection for the 70% of people without adequate or with no social protection in the face of this crisis or climate devastation, then indeed we know that in fact just $35 billion over 5 years would guarantee the poorest 28% of countries universal social protection floors. You add to that 100 billion, 150 billion, a drop in the ocean compared to this expenditure, and it would allow then part payment of social protection to cover deficits in the lower to middle income countries. This is what justice and a new social contract is about. The expenditure on military arms is actually simply a face of injustice we have to actually argue against. Nuclear arms are inhumane and an illegitimate source of power, but after decades of solemn promises and political declarations, governments still fail to deliver, and as I said, in too many cases are rearming. So it was at our Congress just over a year ago that the ITUC decided to renew its commitment to the fight for the prohibition of nuclear weapons and the dismantling of existing arsenals. We've always been part of the peace movement, but now it's time to be more united than ever with the rest of you. The message from the global trade union movement is loud and clear. We need to ban nuclear arms from our societies now. COVID-19 has indeed exposed that multilateralism is in crisis. Global governance reform is fundamental if we are to be equipped to challenge our common global problems in the 21st century, including human rights, labor rights, our common security. I can tell you that 60% of the global workforce is forced to work in the informal sector. No rights, no minimum living wages. It's a picture that the Reverend Liz painted admirably right across the world. So we are calling on the world to end nuclear terror, but we're also calling for a new social contract to let solidarity rule. Jobs, decent work, income, and social protection. Because poverty and inequality threaten peace and stability. This has been the core of historic alliance between the peace and the labour movement, and it must continue to be. Generations, young and old, must jointly gear up for this new challenge, and it's not about one issue. I can assure our young representative from Fridays for the Future, it's about a world where we can have peace and resilience, dealing with all of those emergencies. So change will only come through the power of people and the solidarity of people everywhere. Reverend Liz said it, we need to organise, organise and organise. We are one world. United, we say never again. solidarity.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for that powerful speech. We can't emphasize it enough. Organize, organize, organize. We need to be taking into consideration the rights of workers, and this really is about reshaping a new society. So we really appreciate that. Our next speaker is Reiner Braun, who is Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau and has also played a leading role in helping plan this virtual World Conference. So welcome, Reiner.
Yeah, dear colleagues and dear friends in peace, the coronavirus has changed everything in the world, but not one point. One point has not changed: the dramatic militarization of the world. All 15 wars and the 200 armed conflicts are continuing. NATO countries has even not given an answer to the dramatic ceasefire appeal of UN General Secretary Guterres. NATO will continue to call for a minimum of 2% GDP for the military budget of all NATO countries. The world is spending more than 1.8 trillion on arms and wars, and on Monday, ZIPRI will announce the new figures of the arms expenditure, and it will be not a surprise, the figures will be higher. The US is spending an unbelievable amount of 738 billion for the military. Arms production exports have increased all over the world. We have not forgotten what daily life has become in Yemen. It's a cynical take, but under the condition of the big economic crisis, 2% of GDP will be even less than expected. I'm waiting that Trump is calling for 6%. Even under the circumstances, with daily deaths from the coronavirus, no one of the nuclear weapon countries has stopped the modernization of their nuclear weapons or the development of new ones. We are facing the danger of the end of the last nuclear agreement between Russia and the United States, and we are facing the danger of new nuclear weapons countries. Where are the politicians? Where are the mass media? Who is addressing the issue that hundreds, even thousands of people are dying every day, every second, because of wars in the world, because of the arms conflicts, because of all the small weapons? Who is shouting that every 10 seconds, one child is dying because of hunger and poverty? How many of the poor Korean victims could have survived if the healthcare system in the US and Italy or Spain and all the other countries had not been ruined because we reduced the money for healthcare and spent it for military or wars in the world? Who is raising these questions? Could you hear them in the last weeks? Could you listen to them on the TV? Could you read them in the newspaper? Where are the discussions about that in the parliament? No, and never, nowhere in the world. It is only us, the worldwide peace movement and the social movements, which are mentioning these points, which raise the voice of humanity despite the very difficult circumstances. We are needed in the world situation of worldwide crisis, even more than we often believe. The political class is using the crisis to unite society under their rules, under undemocratic hysteria. Whatever does not follow the elite will be punished in very difficult ways. They are destroying democracy across the world. Every day, authoritarianism is rising. The European Union, often named as a peace project, has continued its intensive program of militarization. The leaders of NATO are even continuing their confrontation with Russia and China in the midst of the pandemic. They still have not given up their fight of a new world order under their global leadership. Above all, the industrial countries are not fulfilling the obligations to avoid a climate disaster despite their current and historical responsibility. And we will see very soon that to overcome the economic crisis, governments will reduce all social, educational, and ecological budgets. Again, the people will pay for the crisis. Big industries will get the subsidies and workers will lose their jobs. Yes, our fight for disarmament against war, for a global transformation, for a new green peace deal, a new world social contract, including conversion programs, will be harder, but is absolutely needed. We must never stop raising the voice for peace and disarmament, as we have always done in the long history of the peace movement. We must do it again and again, on the streets or online, wherever we can. We know that peace is more than absence of war. Peace is in the understanding of Johann Galtung and Noam Chomsky, global justice in a safe environment. The challenge for peace today is a great worldwide transformation to a just and ethical society. No more, but also not less. But every big change starts with the first steps. We need a policy of common security as the alternative to confrontation and sanctions. This is the basis for a world which really wants to solve global problems. The wide range of social movements must cooperate much closer together. Peace and work, peace and environment, peace and global justice, peace and climate protection, they are always two sides of the same coin. Common actions worldwide is a challenge. Our Congress today is a good starting point. Let us continue online and on the streets wherever we are living, loving, and working. We, the activists of peace movement, the International Peace Bureau, will do whatever we can. What are our priorities? First, nuclear weapons, which can destroy the whole planet, must be banned. A nuclear weapons-free world and the immediate global ratification of the ban treaty are the first urgent steps. Second, we need the $1.8 trillion which we are spending on the military for the worldwide healthcare system. That would be a great step in conversion. Beds, medical masks, and ventilators instead of tanks and air fighters. Money for climate security and protection instead of military bases. 300 billion per year are needed for the Sustainable Development Goals. Take the money from the worldwide military budget. And if you say that is more than we spend for the budgets for wars, yes, that is true. But we must never forget, if we take the money from the 1% and giving it to the 99%, there is enough money in the world. We need to transfer it from the right persons, banks, hedge funds, and big companies for the social and environmental purposes. And as urgent tasks, let us support the call of the UN General Secretary for the global peace ceasefire, and let us fight for the end of all sanctions, and please support the IPB healthcare appeal, healthcare instead of military sanctions. This is the background of all common activities with trade unions, with progressive churches, with environmental movements, and above all, those who are combating climate change. The consequences of the big coronavirus, economic, ecological crisis can only lead us to unite the forces for change. Disarmament and world without nuclear weapons and wars are the keystones for global justice and environmental protected world. In every crisis, there's also a chance. Let us accept the challenges we are facing with strength and commitment to make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, for a very impassioned plea on the state of affairs which is happening in terms and the urgent need for us to find the steps. And so we have with this, with the presentation of Reiner, the president of International Peace Bureau, we have actually had the two panels which look at the questions of the present state, and also what are the possible solutions towards it. And as I mentioned, that we are looking forward to your questions that are coming in. We recognize, and as I said, there are thousands of people tuning in from around the world. So we'll be collating the questions to be able to respond, if not here, but also get the answers on the web page. So we are now moving on to our next part of our world seminar, global conference. And we are going to now look at the Hibakusha signature appeal campaign. As we are speaking, it was to be presented by Tanaka Terumi, who's the co-chairperson of the Japan Confederation of the Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Sufferers Organization. This conference is really unique in the sense that we have survivors of the bombing who are called Hibakushas in the Japanese language. And Tanaka, who was to make the presentation, he was 13 years old when the Nagasaki was bombed, and his home was just 32 kilometers from the hypocenter. He lost his grandfather, 2 uncles, an aunt, and a cousin to the bombing in Japan. And Tanaka has repeatedly called upon the United States to offer an apology for the bombing. Currently, due to a technical issue, we are calling upon if Tanaka Terumi is online. If not, we're going to call upon a colleague from Japan, Hiroshi Taka, if you could read the text of Tanaka Terumi's speech. Thank you.
Has one. I think she can read it for him.
Okay. Do you want me to read it for him?
Excuse me, Tanaka is not connected to the audio, so we're gonna need Taka-san to read the speech for him and apologize.
Okay, Taka-san. Is Taka-san on?
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, the Tanaka-san is there, I know, but there is some technical problem, perhaps. Yes, it's a wonderful presentation of Tanaka-san. Tanaka-san is a responsible person of Hidankyo. And there are 2016, centering on the Hidankyo, many organizations gathered to support the appeal by Hibakusha, who called for, in those days, a treaty to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons. And that appeal is widely supported, and many NGOs gathered around it and started collecting signatures. And I understand now the total number of signatures has reached to 10 million plus 500,000. There may be more, but we are sorry because of the COVID-19. It's very hard to give the very precise number, getting the figures from local organizations. But we all must be very pleased to be able to present at least the report that we are continuing our campaign to the representative Nakamichi-san, the High Representative of the United Nations.
Thank you so much, Taka, for sharing that statement. I know that we have the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs and UN Undersecretary General Izumi Nakamitsu on, who will be giving a response to that presentation. So welcome, Ms. Nakamitsu.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this invitation. It's really encouraging. It means a lot to us that you are able to organize such a large meeting through this online measure. And it is a real great pleasure for me to attend this event. And to hear this report on how many signatures have been collected to the petition for nuclear disarmament. Every time I receive the petition, I get a sort of source of energy it keeps me going in this important and yet difficult line of work, elimination of nuclear weapons. And I'm really sorry, I regret that the present circumstances of COVID-19 do not allow me to receive the petition in person, does not allow me to meet with you in person in New York. But I definitely do very much look forward to doing so during the first committee meeting this autumn. For the UN community, your petition is an important reminder that the relevance of nuclear disarmament extends really far beyond our conference rooms. The abhorrence of nuclear weapons and the urgency of their complete elimination is of greatest importance to our world's citizens. And it has been a top priority for the United Nations, as you know. I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the work of the Hibakusha in sharing their testimony of unspeakable horrors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Every time I listen to them, listen to you in person, it really moves me tremendously. The authority with which you speak really cuts across cultures and generations and has moved so many people in their efforts towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. Your advocacy for nuclear disarmament is an unparalleled force for good. The impressive number of signatures that you've collected to date is really a very clear indication of the impact of your work. So again, thank you so very much for your tireless efforts. Sadly, nearly 75 years after the atomic bombings, the average age of the Hibakusha is growing. But your voices are not diminishing. And I'm really heartened also by your extensive efforts to reach out to young people as well. I see that in this conference today, there are a lot of younger people also listening in and participating. And that's exactly what we really want to see. Because encouraging youth to become a force towards nuclear disarmament really is critical in terms of preserving your message for future generations and, of course, ultimately in bringing about a world free of nuclear weapons. The COVID-19 pandemic has confronted all of us with the uncomfortable truth, if you will, that events deemed improbable can occur with the potential to sow devastation in ways that seemed really not imaginable. Global crises do not stop at national borders. I think we are seeing that. And they require, therefore, a collective response. For all the hardship it has inflicted, the pandemic also has the potential, I hope, to unite societies, institutions, and individuals, all of us. I hope that in achieving solidarity through this crisis, we can also transcend our entrenched divisions and achieve other difficult but necessary goals, especially the urgent goal of a total elimination of nuclear weapons. We have been teleworking at the UN, and it's been more than 5 weeks now. But yesterday I went into the UN to record a video message that we will be putting online on Monday, which should have been the opening of the NPT review conference. The message that I really want to convey is that states parties really should even take advantage of the postponement so that they can fill the gap. They can actually bridge the gap and find common ground for moving forward in nuclear disarmament efforts. In the face of heightened global tensions and also a continued and rather unfortunate erosion of the international arms control architecture, progress towards nuclear disarmament really is more urgent than before. The Hibakusha represent the human face of nuclear destruction, and your efforts can remind policymakers that any use of nuclear weapons would be a human tragedy on an unprecedented scale. And I am therefore grateful to every person who has signed this petition and pledged to do my utmost towards the fulfillment of our shared goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. I hope that some of you looked at the message that we posted on ODA's website, the impact of COVID-19. One of the very important messages that we want to convey is that we really have to put humanity at the center of our security. And I think the COVID-19 is really telling humankind to do so. And that is one of the central themes that we also need to remember in our efforts towards a world free of nuclear weapons. I thank you very much for this. I'm very much looking forward to your conference also becoming even a greater, more forceful movements towards our shared and objective. Thank you very much.
On disarmament, really delighted that you could join this global conference and to give your message. Right now, the United Nations has done an incredible role for a long time, since 1946, on looking at nuclear disarmament. And I think the role of the United Nations is very critical at this time, working with communities and nations around the world. We now have a session where we request all the speakers to turn on their videos so that we could take a group picture. And this will be followed by a reiteration of the questions that have come from the audience from around the world, because we have just 6 minutes left before the global conference ends. And we cannot solve all the questions right now, but we will put it on the website of the global conference. So we will take the group photo and followed by some of the key questions that came from all of you. So who is taking the group photo? Mariana? Okay.
Mariana's taking it.
Okay. Is it taken? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I wish we could see everyone in the audience too. Your participation has meant a lot to us. 1,000 participants from around the world across continents: Nepal, India, Costa Rica, Mexico, Australia, Japan. We have it all over the world. So thank you so much. So we now have 5 minutes left. What we're going to do is we have been culling all the questions that you have put across to us, as we mentioned. So some of the key questions relates to, first of all, on the solutions, because many people are asking, we have heard this is 75 years of the bombings, and we have seen what the damages that this has done to all of us. Mariana, I think it's okay if all the speakers are online, actually, but we will see. I think first of the question is in terms of the nuclear disarmament architecture and how issues like the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, a question which came from India, on how this will help in nuclear disarmament. That is one of the questions. Are all the international and multilateral disarmament treaties enough to save us from? And we also know from 2017, when the nuclear ban treaty happened at the United Nations, do you think this will continue to safeguard us? Is one of the key questions which has come in from the audience. Audience wanted to know, what is the time frame of nuclear disarmament? 14,500 nuclear weapons. One is enough to destroy entire cities and create nuclear famine if all the nuclear power is used in the wrong way. So audience are asking for time frame. What needs to be done differently is a lot of questions based on this. We had teachers in our audience today, scholars, academics, people who have joined in from different cross sections who says, how can we involve the youth? Most importantly, the youth, the indigenous community, involve women in decision-making processes towards all of this. Youth involvement as also a critical factor which has come in from the audience. And most importantly, a very critical question has come in on the subject of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, which many of the speakers hadn't touched. But what is very, very important is in terms of what's happening with the issue of nuclear energy and the nuclear weapons connection is some of the questions which has come in. So as I mentioned, that time is very short, so we are not able to get the speakers here to address, but we will be posting this online. With this, I turn over to our other moderator to take us through the concluding remarks of this global conference, which is a work in progress. We thank you for your energy, for your time, and we'll be carrying on. Emily.
Thank you so much, Bina. Obviously, we do have a ton of questions and I can't answer all of them, but I do know that I can speak to the youth engagement. I know a lot of folks were excited about that, wanted to talk more about that. Exactly a week from today, same time, 9 a.m. Eastern time, we will be having a youth assembly. So a conference similar to this, but focused on specifically youth, whatever that means to you. We are guessing hopefully under 40, but we will let you self-identify as a youth. There's more information online on the conference website. I just want to say thank you again to all of our incredible panelists. I'm so grateful for all of your insight and wisdom and energy today. I wish I could tell everyone to give you a round of applause, but we can't hear everyone. So I will give you a round of applause. And I would love to invite you all to check out our conference statement, which is on worldconference2020.org. The statement is really powerful and it's really a show of the collaboration of all of the groups here. So I'm really grateful to all of the conference organizers, to all of the people involved in this, who were involved when it was going to be a physical conference in New York, who were flexible when we pivoted to an online conference. And I just want to say thank you, everyone, and stay safe and healthy. And hopefully we will see some of you, especially if you're on the younger side, next Saturday, May 2nd at 9 a.m. Eastern time. So thank you, everyone.